Welcome back, Ways and Weebies, to the channel Bishop Doge. For today, I am doing another Unpopular Chimps video, the series where I take a look at unpopular 5th tiers that don't tend to get used all that much in the more difficult modes in Bloons Tower Defense, and I find ways to put them to good use in Chimps. Now, sometimes I might end up covering towers which I do still think are bad, but generally I usually try to pick towers which, while unpopular, I actually think are quite good, secretly. Well, I say that, my first episode of course was on Super Monkey Fan Club and Plasma Monkey Fan Club, and I still don't really use those upgrades. For today's episode though, we're covering a tower that I almost never thought I would ever consider to be underrated. Because, in my humble opinion, this tower is one of the very few towers in this game which has literally never been good. You know, most towers in the game that aren't that great right now used to be amazing. I suppose this is kind of a bad example because they just got buffed again now and now they're apparently good again, but Comanche Defense, for example, is an upgrade which recently has been performing very poorly, but if you go back to the start of the game's life, back when, if I remember correctly, the reason why it was so good was because ALK buffs were permanent on the mini planes. They didn't take up like ALK buff stacks. As a result of that, the Comanche Commander, the Comanche Defense, whichever one it is, used to be one of the most powerful 5th tiers in the game back in the day. Of course, that didn't last, and ever since it got nerfed heavily, it never really recovered until recently. And almost every single upgrade in this game has a similar story, where either it was garbage on launch but then got buffed, or maybe it was way too good on launch because of an exploit, so then they removed the exploit or they nerfed the tower and then it's bad. You get the point. There's very few towers left at this point that have truly never been good, and Preemptive Strike was one of the very, very few exceptions I could think of. All that being said, Preemptive Strike got yet another buff this update, and this isn't the first time they've buffed it either. They've been buffing it for a while, and so while my gut feeling was, oh yeah, Preemptive Strike, that upgrade fucking sucks, at this point I've seen it happen far too many times to buy into the hype. Once again, I knew that Bouncing Bullet was crazy good before everyone else caught on, and yet it kept receiving buffs, because it still had that reputation hanging around it of being that meme upgrade that when the game first launched was one of the most overpriced and underwhelming upgrades in the game. And yet, look at where we are now, where Bouncing Bullet Snipers with Alchemists is basically the single best mid-game defense in existence. And I see Preemptive Strike walking a little bit of a similar path, where it genuinely has been awful for a long time, and it stayed awful for a long time. And initially the buffs didn't do much, but the buffs have kept adding up and adding up and adding up. And at this point, I think I'm pretty comfortable saying that Preemptive Strike is actually really strong. Dare I say even maybe like an S tier kind of upgrade, which might sound really over the top, but I'll explain my reasoning here. In the past, the reason why Preemptive Strike has historically been horrible is quite a few reasons. For one, while it's nice to be able to shoot a missile for free at every single mob the second it spawns, if that comes at the cost of actual damage on your 5th tier, it's not really very useful, is it now? I mean, you would get more damage done by being able to shoot faster or do more damage on a tower that can always shoot, rather than having it get this 1 damage boost the second that a balloon spawns, but no more damage beyond that. That's only very helpful against very fast balloons, at which point, well, how many mobs in the game are fast? The answer is 1, DDTs. DDTs are fast, but other than that, there's not really anything that you need to use the Preemptive Strike on, as cool as a gimmick as it may be. As a result, it used to be that the only use of Preemptive Strike was the fact that in fairness, the Preemptive Strike was enough to insta-kill any unfortified DDTs the second they spawn, which basically meant if you got a Preemptive Strike, rounds 90 to 98, you wouldn't have to worry about DDTs. You'd only have to worry about the fortified DDTs on round 99. Of course, this didn't at all make the tower good all of a sudden, because this was a 5th tier you were spending about 50k on in total just to beat the first 4 DDT rounds, but then die to the 5th one. And in terms of the ability itself, all that you get for buying Preemptive Strike, a not cheap upgrade, is an extra 15-second speed up on the already minute-long cooldown of this ability, so it doesn't really do a whole lot. You're not buying Preemptive Strike to do more damage with your first strikes, because just stopping at a first strike will be just as effective and will cost you only about 1/3 of the money. And that leaves the only other reason you might get a Preemptive Strike being the increased damage, when the increased damage is actually quite underwhelming, or at least it was in the past. especially when you consider that the specialty of these missiles was supposed to be that they deal massively increased ceramic damage. But then you take a look at the Sub-Commander, the bottom path 5th tier, and its amazing damage against super ceramics and group balloons in general, and you kind of think, wow, I don't know when I'm getting a Preemptive strike, but I'm not getting a Sub-Commander. Sub-Commander just blew it out of the water every single time. Really, the only way in which Preemptive strike could beat the Sub-Commander is that it was better against DDTs. But even if you were just desperate to deal with DDTs, there are far more cheap and effective upgrades in the game to deal with DDTs. If DDTs are a huge problem, you want an Icicle Impale. You want maybe a Super Glue with camo detection. Hell, on its own it's a little bit sketchy, but you may even just want a main Moab. You do not want to be spending 50,000 on getting a Preemptive strike that doesn't even deal with all the DDTs, just most of them until 99 comes, and then it doesn't deal with them anymore. So far I've basically just been describing why this tower was always historically terrible. Bottom path was always better for pure damage, the ability didn't get much better, so you just stop at first strike instead of buying Preemptive strike. And the Preemptive strike thing itself was basically just a free pass through rounds 90 to 98, but then as soon as 99 comes, you die. Unless you get more DDT defense, at which point why didn't you just get DDT defense in the first place, rather than trying to cheat the system by getting a Preemptive strike which doesn't even really work. But now, one simple thing has changed. With the amount of buffs that the Preemptive strike has gotten to the fire rate of its missiles and the damage of the missiles over time, we are now at the point where this tower actually does good damage. Like, no joke. Now, this still might not sound very compelling, because sure, maybe it does good damage now, but Sub-Commander does really good damage, and that's cheaper too, and it buffs all your other subs. So why wouldn't you just get Sub-Commander instead? Well, aside from what I already mentioned, that Sub-Commander is not as good against DDTs, you also have the fact that now Preemptive strike with all the buffs genuinely kind of is the better option against super ceramics. In fairness, both of these towers are pretty good against super ceramics, but there's one critical difference between the Preemptive strike and the Sub-Commander. While both of them are not 100% reliable, but pretty reliable with dealing with group ceramics, the difference with the Preemptive strike is that the Preemptive strike can shoot through walls. With advanced intel, you basically have infinite range on this attack, whereas the Sub-Commander, well, you can get advanced intel, but even once you get it, if you're playing a more difficult map with a lot of line of sight blockers, it's not going to be getting anywhere near as much value as the Preemptive strike. But despite all this praising I'm doing right now, I should make it clear I wasn't instantly convinced. My first game using the buff Preemptive strike, I was kind of mixed. I was impressed with the damage it was doing, because of course I'm used to this tower being awful, but I also kind of thought to myself, well, is it really that good? You know, every 5th tier has impressive damage. If this just has good damage now, but not much else, that doesn't really make it good all of a sudden, does it now? I mean, does a Glaive Lord do good damage? Well, I would say so, yeah. But would I ever use Glaive Lord? God knows I've tried, and I don't use Glaive Lord. No, it is really bad in my opinion. But the longer I played around with this new Preemptive strike, the more I realized why this is actually so powerful, despite the fact that I do agree there are probably some 5th tiers out there that can get more pure damage for less cost. And that is the fact that, while obviously damage does matter, it's not that it doesn't matter, a lot of the times when I'm trying to beat a difficult map on Chimps, I'm not thinking just, oh, what does the most damage, slap that down. A lot of the time, I'm kind of trying to fill out a checklist of, okay, do I have something that deals with DDTs? Okay, do I have something that deals with the bat on round 100? Okay, do I have something to deal with hordes of super ceramics and fortified super ceramics? Okay, do I have something to deal with group Moabs? And once you've got all these things ticked off, you're finally in a good spot. It's obviously still possible that some weird mid-ground happens where you do have good group Moab damage and you do have good group Ceram, but you just get a weird mix between the two where you just have a little bit not enough of both of them and you get in a bit of trouble. But obviously most of the time, as long as you have a tower that's good against DDTs, a tower that's good against the bad, a tower that's good against group Moabs, and a tower that's good against super Cerams, not necessarily having to be 4 separate towers, of course, you might find a tower that does multiple of those jobs in one. If you are able to do that, then you will beat Chimps. That's generally how it goes. And this is where it all comes together. I think the reason why I've been convinced that Preemptive Strike may genuinely be one of the better 5th tiers in the game now, despite how underwhelming it has always been in the past, is that now it genuinely ticks so many of these boxes now that it's gotten all these buffs. We've already shown how this thing just deletes DDTs the second they spawn, and while it doesn't delete the fortified DDTs on round 99, you don't actually really need an Icicle Impale or a Super Glue anymore because the increased damage it has on its basic attack allows it to, with just a little bit of help, you break the rest of the fortified DDTs. Even if they're not instantly killed, they're still weakened by the Preemptive Strike by quite a significant amount. So you've got most of the DDTs for the entire game covered by getting a Preemptive Strike. But if it was just that, it would still be far too expensive. On top of that though, this thing deals with the bad on round 100. Of course, you would usually be getting a first strike anyway to take down the bad on round 100, and getting Preemptive Strike is even better. So you don't have to worry about round 100 anymore, which means that you don't have to worry about, oh, I shouldn't make my defense too reliant on like having too many Moab stuns because that doesn't work on the bad, because you have the delete bad button on this tower. So yeah, there you go, there's round 100 solved. Okay, what else is left? Super Ceramics and Group Moabs. This thing is literally designed to melt ceramics, so it's actually pretty damn good against Super Ceramics. Don't get me wrong, I think there are a couple options in the game that are better than this, but even the options I can think of that can do this job better, or for cheaper, are not options with infinite range. The only one I can think of that has infinite range that could do a comparably effective job in terms of ceramic damage is the Spirit of the Forest Druid. And of course, the Spirit of the Forest Druid, while definitely still effective, has its drawbacks and definitely isn't the best on Moab damage. It's mostly just for dealing with Super Ceramics. So while I'm not saying the Spirit of the Forest Druid is, of course, a weak option, I am saying that if you need a bit more Moab damage in your defense, but you still need a way to deal with Super Ceramics, then the Preemptive Strike is a pretty strong option. You probably will still need a couple slows for the ceramics to make it so that it actually works. I imagine on some of the more difficult maps with less track lengths to work with, it will probably struggle to deal with the super ceramics before they reach the exit, but I don't think it needs that much help before it will be able to deal with basically all the super ceramics you'll see all game. Which basically just leaves Group Moabs, which already, in my opinion, is the least concerning out of those four things, since Moabs are so slow aside from DDTs. And I feel like generally half the options in the game are good 5th tiers for dealing with Group Moabs that do a lot of Moab damage. I mean, there's stuff like Apache Prime, Archmage, Moab Domination, and hey, even our buddy the Glaive Lord. Which, by the way, this is a perfect example of why I think the Glaive Lord is so bad, despite the fact that it doesn't really seem that bad when you put it down. Simple fact is, it's very expensive at 35k just for the upgrade, let alone the money you have to spend before then to get the more glaives. And then, what do you get? You do get a 5th tier that does a lot of damage, but the way it does damage isn't very helpful. It does do group balloon damage, but it doesn't quite do enough ceramic damage to be a reliable defense against super cerams unless you found a really nice spot on the track to put it, where it can get a nice long curve, but if you're playing a map like that, you're probably playing an intermediate or beginner map. It's not very good against DDTs, it's not very good against the bad, and the only thing it is good against is once again Group Moabs, which I've already just said, a lot of towers are good against, and a lot of those towers either are better than the Glaive Lord, or they are cheaper, or they are more flexible. Once again, the Glaive Lord's damage isn't bad, but it doesn't really matter that its damage isn't bad. If its damage is mostly only good for dealing with Group Moabs, when you can get 50 other towers that do that job, and those towers probably are going to have some other upsides that the Glaive Lord doesn't. This might sound like a sidetrack, but I think it's a good idea to contrast these two. I think both of these towers have about comparable damage output for cost. Even though they're very different kinds of towers, both of these 5th tiers clearly do a lot of damage. But where Glaive Lord fails is that it only really covers one base really effectively, being able to deal with Group Moabs, which, as I keep saying, I don't think is that difficult to do. And where Preemptive Strike succeeds is that it honestly kinda ticks all of these boxes. Now, I will be honest, that last one, Group Moabs, is probably its weakest attribute. It still absolutely does a good job against Group Moabs because, I mean, it does shoot explosives that hit multiple targets, you know, it's kind of made for that. But while it does have decent Moab damage, there are definitely better options out there for a 5th tier, if Moab damage is what you want. Now, you might think that this is still not very convincing, because although it sounds great to have a tower that is a 5th tier all-in-one covers basically everything you need to beat chimps, you might also be a bit suspicious. Considering for basically all of these things I added a caveat. Great against DDTs, but ooh, needs a bit of help for 99. Great against group Moabs, but not the best. There are technically some other towers that are better. Great against super ceramics, but it might need a couple slows to help it across the way. Great against the bad, but you do need to get it down to its last little bit of HP before you fire for it to be able to insta-kill it. Because there are these little caveats to every single one of these attributes, I would understand if someone was a bit more suspicious of whether this tower is really as good as I say. But you see, this is the thing. Don't get me wrong, there are these caveats, but a lot of these caveats don't matter until the last couple rounds. Now that doesn't mean they don't matter at all. Of course, the last couple rounds are some of the scariest rounds, but by those last couple rounds, you have more money to solve the problem. Preemptive Strike is good enough at dealing with super ceramics that while it will probably need help by round 98, you can kind of cheap out a little bit on super ceram defense up until that point. Preemptive Strike doesn't insta-kill all DDTs because of round 99, but because you buy yourself an extra 9 rounds to prepare yourself, you now obviously can save up more money for your DDT defense. And once again, while its group Moab damages are going to struggle to take down things like groups of zombies, not only can the ability help you out a lot there, but on top of that, for the most part, you do not see group zombies like almost at all in Chimps. It takes until the very last few rounds of the game for zombies to appear in numbers even greater than 2 at once. So this is why I feel that Preemptive Strike is so effective. Not only is it just generally good defense for cost, not only does it innately pop lead, not only does it innately see camo, not only as long as you take the top cross path does it have full map range, but on top of that, it's able to shoot through walls, it's able to deal with basically everything you're concerned about in Chimps mode on your checklist, and it only needs a little bit of help. And even then, it will only need the little bits of help with some of the things on the checklist by the time you're at the last few rounds of the game and you've got the money to spare. So, with all that said, I haven't really talked much about my defense on the screen because there's not much to say. There's a sub-commander obviously buffing the Preemptive Strike so that it deals increased damage, and just because sub-commanders are fun and cool tower anyway. I also, of course, got a carrier flagship to give it another attack speed boost because that buffs all water monkeys. I even got this little ace fighter plane. Obviously, I don't remember if I got it up to a dart storm or not at some point, but either way, I wasn't going to get a sky shredder, but you know, if I was going to get the flagship anyway, I may as well get the ace. And if I remember right, I needed it to deal with the first Moab. I know this isn't going to line up with the footage because that would have been earlier. Whatever, I don't remember off the top of my head. And of course, this went so well that, as you're going to see, I decided to go into free play and see how far I could go with this. Although, I imagine we're coming to the end of that right about now, because I'm not going to lie, I kind of forgot about bads, and I spent way too much money on things to slow mobs down, because I was worried about DDTs, when honestly I should have been worried about bads. I was just still in the mindset of, oh, I can just nuke it with one first strike, and I'm like, oh right, yeah, HP scaling, I kind of can't nuke it with just one first strike. Also, there's going to be 3 of them, whoops. Either way, this was one of the easiest Chimps runs I've had on an advanced map, and while I understand this isn't one of the harder advanced maps per se, this still was surprisingly relaxing, and I attribute a lot of that to how just amazing Preemptive Strike is. This is a first attempt run right here. And obviously, given its full map range, innate camo detection, and innate lead popping, I wouldn't be surprised if this is a really good tower now to attempt to use when beating expert maps. With all that said, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. I promise I have more ideas for this series, I have to be bothered to do it is the problem. Either way, I'll see you next time. Goodbye.